it's a good idea to do, as opposed to necessarily things that are going to help me make my system more predictable and be able to systematically lower risk. So one of the things that is how we can use models, in fact, to close the gap between assessment, which is what I feel like a lot of governance and are you going to help me here? Hello? Okay, all right, cool. Okay, closing the gap between assessment and defense. So, what does that mean? There's three major places where I see risk and threat modeling as being useful to a risk management program. Design, management, and operations. And what I mean here when I say design is not just design of the control system, but the design of the system itself. Embedding risk management into the design of your system itself. And then management here meaning the processes that we undertake in order to keep the system predictable. And finally, operations. In the operations section, I'm talking a little bit more about really technical modeling, like statistical modeling efforts that you would actually employ in running your system. So when we think about design, if you are of the nature that you think security should be built in as opposed to bolted on, I think that you would find hope in this quote, Len Fisher, who's has written some books on game theory, suggesting that evolution favors strategies that minimize the risk of loss as opposed to maximize the chance of gain. And I think that human behavior is such that folks are actually risk averse. Most people don't really have a high tolerance for risk. Successful systems are going to be the ones that are able to defend and evolve against unnecessary risks. And this is one of the reasons why system models are actually different from maps. I think when we do assessments, whether for compliance purposes or for enterprise risk management purposes, essentially what we are doing is we are cataloging or inventorying components, which allows us to kind of design maps of our system. We know where things are, and we can count the things that are wrong with them or the things that are out of compliance, for example. But models actually include dynamics. The influences that drive how a system actually behaves, not just what is in the system. The other thing that is quite interesting about system models is that you have to have an understanding of your system boundaries. A system model, essentially, I could whiteboard it, I suppose, but if you just want to imagine, a system model could just be a circle with input, something goes on, and output. And the better the model, the better your ability to predict based on a certain input and your understanding of your dynamics what the output is going to be. So that sounded like a lot of fun. Let's bring that back to something a little more real. You're a system owner, you own a system, perhaps it's a network, perhaps it's a website, perhaps it's a whole company. In security, and a lot of the compliance and GRC programs that are out there put an emphasis on defining a perimeter, hardening it, and then trying to maintain within the system some level of security as defined by best practices or some kind of standard. However, that's not really the reality of how our systems work, right? No system is, what's the word? Whatever, wholly unto itself. No man is an island, and no system is either. Our systems don't exist just for their own purposes. They exist because we have users to serve or partners that we work with. And there's a lot of moving parts in our system, and a lot of things coming from the outside and connecting to the inside. It's how things work. In payments, how this works, or at least in my, we actually have users who can log into our system. I think about that for a moment. I work for PayPal. Where are PayPal's system boundaries? Are our system boundaries at our firewalls, or are they at our users' client systems? So if you acknowledge that your risk is interconnected with your customers or your users or your partners' risk, then you have to acknowledge the boundary of your system is a lot broader than what you necessarily have control over in your own day-to-day operations. Why is it useful to acknowledge this? It's useful to acknowledge this because when you're dealing with attacks or risks or or whatever you want to call them, those things that are coming from the outside in, or, there could be an insider threat as well, but let's just say threat agents are external to the appropriate processing of your system. Where are those threats going to manifest? Are they going to manifest on your systems, or do you also need to take into consideration, in order to estimate what's really going to happen in your system, are you going to have to understand the vulnerability or the system dynamics of your users as well? And that's kind of a rhetorical question, because I think we all acknowledge that when we have users, client security can be just as important as, say, having a hardened firewall in place. All right, so everybody likes to talk about fraud. I want to give a really high-level example of a threat model, something that I find a little bit useful, something that sort of summarizes some of the concepts I'm talking about around design. Now, I have here an example of essentially a genericized version of fraud. In this case, it's buyer fraud. And in trying to diagram this out, I initially started with threat tree diagram. Are any of you familiar with Schneier's paper on this? He published it in like 99. Thank you very much. So I really liked the paper, and what I was wondering what we could do with threat trees if they were iterative. And what I kind of mean there is how can you map out an entire system using a threat tree? And I had a really hard time doing that, because what I found was the actual mechanisms by which the threats manifested clustered. And so what I mean here is in trying to sort of diagnose or from a high level expose what the actual threat model is for fraud, everything was clustering in these three categories. There was some kind of technical exploit, and then some kind of misuse of credentials, but ultimately then funds come out of the system. And so when you sort of cluster these, you can kind of cut and paste which type of attack or exactly what it is that the fraudster does. But let's walk through it. Okay, someone sends out a phishing email. The phishing mail has an obfuscated link. Maybe it's using a URL shortener, or maybe it's actually using the special character code set, whatever, so that you can't actually see that it's redirecting you. And then you are redirected someplace where either you're asked for your credentials and you give them up, or you get a drive-by malware and your credentials are sucked right off of your computer, in which case now an evil actor has your credentials. And so, of course, when we kind of look at the market for credential theft, we find that it's not always the person who has grabbed the credentials that actually uses them. Reselling that happens within that industry, which is kind of an interesting economic thing to look at on its own. But eventually then, someone has to be the actor, the fraudster. And so even though it was a technical exploit that started off this chain, then what ends up happening is your basic, boring, run-of-the-mill financial fraud. Someone's going to use a stolen credit card, or they're going to use a stolen bank account, or they're going to ATO some kind of account. They're going to impersonate someone. They're going to commit fraud, and some kind of transaction happens. But that's not all, necessarily, because eventually the person who commits the fraud is going to want money out of the system. They want cash. They want something that they can convert into cash. So, if you're interested, there's a couple different ways to do that. You can buy goods that are easily resold. You can, like digital goods or consumer electronics, or you can try and figure out how to bounce funds around across different systems in order to extract cash to yourself. So, any questions about this? Oftentimes people questions about fraud. Yes? What's ATO? Sorry, account takeover is what that stands for. So I think, yeah, okay. Any other questions? But you see how the technical attack, it could be any kind of thing. You could have phishing, or you could have malware, or you could have, a joke program. It doesn't have to be someone gives something up, or that someone extrapolates something based on pulling information from social networks. There's all different kinds of ways you can get through the chain, but ultimately the output is money comes out. And that's the really interesting part for us, because for folks who are in fraud, because of course that's where it becomes really real for us. The other thing to note here is up there on the exploit vulnerability section, those aren't things that happen on our system that we can control, but the threats that we face from this type of activity manifest on our system in a really real and direct way, and it behooves us to understand how the whole chain works when we are designing our controls. For us at PayPal, for example, not only do we have extensive controls on the system, but we also have outbound efforts, because if you want to attack a threat, then you're economical and opportunistic in how you do that. And so if we can help, for example, get rid of phishing sites, then that helps reduce our propensity to see this kind of behavior. All right, so you've designed a system, you designed the controls. That means you have an idea of how the system is supposed to behave. Well, then what do? You figure out where you were wrong and you iterate. That's where management comes in. So Douglas Hubbard, who's the author of The Failure of Risk Management, pretty popular book among us academic risk wonks lately, has a great quote, which is, risk management that reacts to yesterday's news is not risk management at all. True, but if you're not aware of your history, you're kind of doomed to repeat it. Did you guys catch that? Do I have to repeat that? Probably not. Oh, that would be even easier. Switching mics. Okay. But the problem with this idea that reacting to old news is bad, it doesn't work. You have to be able to learn, and that's where it's really important to have feedback loops in your system that you can kind of instrument so that you understand what your performance is. Because essentially what management is having an estimated performance and then managing the operations of your system to that performance. And when something is not working, if something is behaving in a way that is not what you need to meet your objectives, you go in and you change it, which is why design and management are sort of iterative processes here. And let me move on quickly to operations, because I know that we're going to talk a little bit more about metrics later. The way that technically risk management dives into operations usually has to do with the automation of decisions. So an example of a system model that is driven into operations I want to give is sort of active traffic flow analysis. Basically, the way the way the timings of lights on city streets are put into place. There are a lot of different heavy-duty statistical quants who work on these problems trying to optimize traffic flow through streets, just as an example. So you can imagine that that gets pretty complicated. And just sort of a nice little quote from one of my favorite physicists, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. Absolutely, that is true. And however, using computers can really help you do that. And the way that we use quantitative models that are driven into operations is basically to assist in making system decisions. And this is when we actually come back to the concept of feedback loops. In management, we're interested in feedback loops because feedback loops give us an understanding of metrics, how we're performing.